We're going to talk a little bit about solar filter technology, and things have changed a lot from when I first started looking at these things about 30 odd years ago. And I brought along a few samples of some of the types of solar filters that I've been working with in my preparations for this eclipse with the American Astronomical Society and their education campaign for safety at this eclipse. So let's see if we can get this thing to work. Do I have control on the slides, or can you change it?
It's on. You can see it.
It's
Yeah,
Which one is it?
which button is it?
Okay, so we're using this one.
No, just to use the wheel.
The wheel? Ah, okay. Good. Okay, so the thing is, why are we concerned about eye safety on solar eclipses? Well, total phase of the eclipse is not really the point. It's during the partial phases before and after where we're really concerned about eye safety, because as the sun disappears behind the moon, as Mike said, the light level is going down. I'm not really quite aware of that, but we're trying to look at the sun. And the thing to remember is that the exposed part of the sun's surface that we can still see uncovered by the moon is every bit as bright during the eclipse as it is outside of the eclipse. So there's a lot of light being produced, and it can cause damage to the eye very, very easily. And what we do know is that very intense visible light is going to cause what we call a photochemical retinal damage in the back of the eye. And it's the sustained or the repeated views of that very, very bright light source that causes the damage. When I see a patient with this kind of problem, it's really sometimes hard to tell, because the way that eye looks the morning after usually, it's very, very different with each patient. It really is a very, very individual response. And even the way that the patient comes in describing their problem is very different. The thing is that when the eye is injured in a solar eclipse, when you're looking at the partial phases, the damaged cells continue to work. They're essentially dead men walking. And they continue to function for several hours after they've been very severely damaged. And, you go through the eclipse, get through dinner, go to bed, everything's fine. Next morning you wake up, you suddenly realize when you look in the bathroom mirror that you can't see your face. Or you go down, you sit at breakfast and you notice that the person across the table from you, you can't tell who it is from just looking at them, because you're missing the details right in the middle of the visual field, where your vision is supposed to be the sharpest and the most detailed. That part of the retina is actually severely damaged. It stopped functioning overnight. And this is what we refer to as a latency period, that we have this delay between the actual damage and the actual onset of symptoms. And so, we can have persons coming in with maybe a little bit of that, or very, very severe effects. And the thing is that, unfortunately, the nature of that damage is such that the actual recovery, for most people, is prolonged, but eventually they get their vision back. If they saw 20/20 before the event, they'll get maybe 20/20 or 20/25 coming back. So comparable to what they had before they were hurt. But there's always the unlucky few, for one reason or another, who don't recover. And so the thing is, looking at an individual, we can't tell what's going to happen in the future. It's sort of 50-50 whether you're going to get their vision back. And that's why it's so important for us to try and protect them. And, the work on this, I've done some of it myself, and it's sort of an accumulation of data from the last half century or so from me and my colleagues. And the problem is that a lot of this is experimental work, using experimental animals, and to be frank about it, if I tried to do the same experiment today, in today's atmosphere of granting councils and ethics committees and animal welfare, I'd never get in the door. Just can't do those experiments anymore. In fact, when you look in the literature, the very earliest of the things that were done on this kind of damage was done not on animals, but on humans. And in fact, one has to wonder about some of the ethics of some of those earlier studies, but that's another story. Well, who is most likely to get hurt? And again, this is something that I've conducted surveys, and I've had surveys done by colleagues around the world over the years. And who are they that are typical people who are going to get hurt? Well, young adult male, 15 to 25, unaware or ignored the warnings altogether. Couldn't possibly happen to me. And used either the inappropriate protection or no protection. Gee, am I talking about solar eclipse actors? And yeah, it's the morning after when they were affected. There's other things like that too in their lives, but I digress. Anyway, it all is centered around the fact that when these injuries occur, you're not aware of it because there's no pain sensor at the back of the eye. That's why when we do see people having eye surgery done, they can be awake. In fact, for a lot of eye surgeries, the surgeons want the people awake so that they can tell if there is something going wrong, because they'll ask them, what can you see? And so the fact that it's painless means that you can damage the back of the eye and not be aware of it. And again, this latency is something that does play a role. Again, the eye is still functioning perfectly well hours after the event. It's not until considerably later that, in fact, symptoms begin. And then, of course, we have the problem of the recovery. The other thing that goes along with it is that it depends on the size of the image. Again, Mike was talking about the size of the solar image being, a critical thing. In the eye, with an unaided view of the sun, as a lot of these people are doing when they're injured, they're looking at the sun as a ½ degree object in the visual field, extremely small. Okay, and Sean was just doing that. If you hold your pinky out at arm's length, that's probably about the size of it, just a little smaller than that. But it's enough to wipe out your visual world if that part of the eye is affected. And so that's one of the things. Now, the problem is, if people are using optical aids like a binocular or a telescope and looking at the sun without the protection, the image is much bigger, which means it can wipe out more of the retina. And so the loss is that much more profound. And the other thing that comes in, and this is the ringer, is that when we get a very much larger image, not only are we getting the direct damage of the photochemical effect that is affecting the cells, but also we get heat effects being built up, because that's an awful lot of energy being poured into the eye. It gets absorbed by the pigment that lines the inside of the eyeball, and when that light energy is absorbed by that very dark pigment, melanin, the same stuff that turns your skin tan, but we've got a lot of that at the back of, in the inside of the eye as a light trap. And it takes that excess energy and turns it into heat. And so we get a combination of effects of thermal as well as photochemical damage. The more thermal damage we have, the more permanent the effect is going to be. And so, again, looking through a telescope or binoculars or a camera lens without the additional protection is just asking for disaster rates. With that much bigger image, we're wiping out more of the retina. Okay, so what we do know is that with these types of injury, we've got two different things. We have different parts of the spectrum that we have to worry about. The photochemical effect is mainly due to short wavelength light. Now, a lot of you have probably read recently on the RASC list, among other things, about artificial light at night, problem with blue light exposures from things like cell phones and so on, those displays. Well, those are different types of effect, but again, they are on the short wavelength part of the spectrum. Now, we do know that when it comes to this kind of damage, as we can see on the slide here, this kind of damage is due to the short wavelength, and it's the most common type of injury that we get in solar eclipse injuries. And again, it's usually a temporary thing unless the thermal effect starts to come into play. The other thing that can happen, and this is actually something that happens more associated with laser eye damage, is this thermal injury, where we need a lot more energy. Notice the threshold there in the second line, about 28,000 watts per square meter dosage, whereas with this it's 3 watts per square meter. So quantum efficiency plays a big, big role. But with thermal injury, this is the thing that's going to cause some permanent loss. So we have to take away from those things. Well, 1999 Eclipse was when the world of standards started to really seriously think about how it would be possible to deal with the many types of products that were out there. So, for example, we've got these Eclipse viewers like this with the black polymer type filter. And in Europe particularly, they were concerned about how they could control the production of these things and the sale of these devices. And it's a very, very different regulatory environment compared to North America, because these kinds of devices are legally classified as protective devices. And that means they fall under a European Union set of laws which deal with protective devices. And if you've got something that doesn't comply with that particular regulation, it can actually be confiscated and destroyed. Or its importation can be prohibited. So they've got a lot more legal things that they can do, but they needed some kind of standard to respond to it. Now, in the typical standards world responses, the big crisis was 1999. And I was involved a lot with the discussion in the United Kingdom about the safety of various types of solar filters. They actually, the manufacturers actually sent me over to England to do a tour to talk about the filters and to try to weed through all of the controversies. I ended up having to testify or send reports rather to the High Court in Britain in a lawsuit that occurred after that over the problem of solar filters. So I was really quite involved. But you notice that what happened was that in 2005, the European Committee for Standardization actually published a standard for solar filters. And this was the first time that an actual standard was produced that dealt with filters for direct observation of the sun. And it was a subtitle for the standard, which was European Normal 1836, which was actually for non-prescription sunglasses. And there was a 2-paragraph entry in there for the solar filters. They produced it really quickly. The problem was 1999. The committee started work in 1999. They got it published in 2005. That's fast in the world of standards. But the interesting thing about it is that because of this European Directive 686, it meant that anybody who wanted to sell these kinds of products in Europe would have to comply with the thing and go through certification. And so this is a good thing. And in fact, we were able to use that in 2012 with the Australian government to start the work on the Queensland solar eclipse. And the solar filters and viewers had to have the CE mark, which meant compliance with the European standard. And there was this language on both sides of the viewer, which was again specified by the standard to certify compliance. And the Queensland Government Directive was a really interesting document which referred to the EN 1836 as well as its parallel Australian standard to really control the importation of these devices. The nice thing was that unlike Western Australia, which had banned solar filters for that eclipse, we got the Queensland government to actually encourage their use. And so they had a lot of very good solar filters available for that eclipse, for those who managed to see it on the seashore, depending on where you were with the cloud cover. Well, I've been Canada's delegate to the International Standards Organization now for about 10 years. And when the ISO standards people said we should start looking at developing a sunglass standard, then I sort of stuck my hand up and said, well, maybe we ought to look at 1836 and do something about solar filters as well, realizing that we had a number of these events coming around in Europe and Australia and Asia. It would be nice to have something that had a global effect rather than a regional or national one. And it took about 3 years for us to get this standard. And in 2015, we published ISO 12312-2, which is filters for the direct observation of the sun. And this is, in fact, a standard which has been adopted in Europe in replacement of the EN standard. And I got my fingerprints all over this particular document. Now, what it does is it takes a look at hazard analysis. And what we're looking at from a radiant energy point of view is what part of the optical spectrum is really important in causing eye damage when you look at the sun. Well, we're running from the ultraviolet here through the visible and then into the infrared. The two red lines actually show you that part of the long wave and short wave limits on what actually goes into the eye, as opposed to what comes through from the sun, through our atmosphere. So this spectrum, which dates to 1940, and in fact is probably the best documented spectrum for the sun around, is what we use as our benchmark for looking at all of this stuff. But here at about 280 nanometers, this is UVB as we call it. This is the stuff, the radiation that causes sunburn. And you can see the energy rises fairly quickly. It peaks at around 430 or so, more or less even until we get to 680. And then it gradually goes down. We've got some absorption bands here for water vapor. And here at 1400, this basically is where the structures of the eye cut off the long wave part of the spectrum from getting to the retina. So it's this passband here from about 280 to 1400 that we have to guard against. Now, when we started looking at these problems of eye protection, in the early days, the technology of glass welding and filters and so on, it turned out that those very luckily seemed to fill the bill, but they were for a different purpose. For example, if you take a look at welding sources like oxyacetylene flakes, where you're putting gas and oxygen together, igniting them, and getting yourself a very nice bright flame. Well, you can see that this man is in a aluminum suit, a reflector suit, and he's operating this thermal lance, which is an oxyacetylene flame, that is used to cut through concrete and ash and coke furnaces and things like that. That man actually, in the hour or two that we were working on this, there I am taking the measurements of the output,
outside and I'm breathing in the fumes. But he had a little opening in that suit. He ended up with third-degree burn on his belly as a result of just standing there in front of that flame, unfortunately. But typically with this kind of flame source, here's the output. We've got some line radiation here. Here's the blue wavelengths down here at 400, going over into the visible. And essentially, there's no measurable ultraviolet, and there's no measurable infrared out here. It's not to get into long infrared that you start getting the effect of that for infrared radiation. But it is bloody hot in the meantime. Here's another kind of welding source. This is an electric arc welding operation. So you have here an electric arc, high voltage, high amperage, and here's what you get depending on what type of metal it is, what kind of flux there is, and whether there's any forming gas in there that's used to stabilize the arc as it melts the metal and lets it run together. Notice you've got a lot of these lines of emission from 200, so that's really far into the ultraviolet, and these lines extend out into the infrared. And there's an awful lot of energy here being given off from the ultraviolet. This is the stuff that gives you welding arc flash, that causes welders to have all sorts of problems with their eyes. Luckily for them, they've got these welding filters nowadays that actually are very good liquid crystals that block this ultraviolet, whether they're activated or not, so we don't see that kind of injury. But welding technology was to address these types of things in the same kind of arc. It just turned out that because of the very bright light flare, we found that it also worked very well for looking at the sun. But the optical quality of these types of filters is not particularly good. And so when we were starting to look at this particular standard to try and rationalize the requirements, what we did was we looked at what exactly was in the solar spectrum that we wanted to guard against. And again, what we concluded was that although they do work, when it comes to writing the standard, we can't use welding projector standards for solar viewers. And David Slimey, who's a friend and colleague from way back, he used to work for the U.S. Army in Maryland, and I wrote this rationale as part of the appendix for the standard. So, yeah, our points were that the retinal hazard in phototoxicity is, again, due to visible light being poured onto the eye for a prolonged period of time, especially when people are looking at an eclipse, and that infrared and ultraviolet in the solar spectrum are really not significant sources of concern for us in this particular context. Another important thing is that for visual comfort, as well as safety, we need to reduce the light from the sun, or from its disk, by at least 160,000 times. So that's going to be a very, very dark filter. And the other thing was that if you've got it right in permitted luminous transmittance ranges for these filters in the standard, they've got to be certainly below this transmittance ratio coming down 160. So typically, when you take a look at these kinds of devices, you can't just use a light meter to measure this transmission, because it is reducing the light by a good 250,000 times or so. So it's really dark. And it's not something that you want to be walking around, especially in a dimly lit room like this, because you can't see anything through these things under these circumstances. They only work in looking at the sun. Okay, so here's what we've come up with as the transmission requirements for these particular devices. What we want is that the maximum luminous transmittance will be allowed to be 0.003% of incident light. And that's equivalent to a welder's filter shade 12, which is probably one of the most common of the types of filters that's used for arc welding. The minimum permitted transmittance is equivalent to shade 15, which is 0.000061%. Now, why do we put a minimum in there? Well, it's because at shade 15, that barely allows you to see the sun if theoretically you are standing on the equator looking at the sun at noon through an absolutely perfectly clear sky, which means you are also looking at the sun placed at the zenith. Okay? At the zenith. When is the sun ever at the zenith? Never. So the thing is that in our latitudes, if you were to wear a shade 15, you probably would not be able to see the sun at all in our typical sky. And so we have a practical limit there, which is because of visibility. Okay? What we also do is include a requirement for the ultraviolet transmission. So UVA is the wave band that tans your skin. UVB is what will burn your skin, cause a sunburn. So we have to include those in our requirements in order to meet European regulation. And what we did was just said it's got to not exceed the transmission level, whatever it is that we find in the visible wavelength. Oops, we don't want to go quite that far yet. Let's see, where do we? There we go. Okay, the other thing is, notice the infrared transmittance, we're allowing up to 3%. Okay. Yeah, much different from what we see in the requirements for welding filters, because what we're seeing is that with the sun, the infrared is not an issue. And we can allow for a higher transmittance level in that wave band. From a technological point of view, this is advantageous because there's a lot of materials that work very well in blocking the UV and the visible, but are lousy for the infrared. And if we were using the criteria for welding filters, those types of materials would fail. And there's no reason for them to fail in this context. Okay, shade numbers, this is basically how you work them out. You work out your transmittance not in percentage, but as a fraction of the incident light. So 1% is 0.01, put that in, for example, and go through that calculation to get what you need. And that's the way you set those particular numbers. So shade number 12 is the brightest we allow, shade 15 is the darkest that we allow in these filters. Now, I also brought along some transmission curves, as you saw, and they are for some of these particular devices that I brought in for you to look at. So, for example, here is some solar filter that's available in sheet form. This happens to be a Rainbow Symphony / Thousand Oaks black polymer with an aluminum coating. So this is the stuff you can actually buy and make your own solar filters for your telescope or your binoculars. And it comes in sheet sizes, and you can put them into whatever amount you want. This is a logarithmic axis here for transmissions in percentage. So here we have 10% transmissions, 1%, 1/1000, or sorry, 10% transmissions. Yeah, that's right. We're just going further and further down. So anyway, out here you see a lot of noise. One of the problems is that when we start measuring these things, the spectrophotometers that are capable of doing these measurements end up with a lot of noise, and it doesn't take a huge amount of dark current or whatever else is going on to mask your signal quite significantly. So there's a lot of processing. This right here is a problem that we see in all instruments because this is a switch over from lead sulfide detector to a photoelectric cell for the sensors that are used in these instruments. And at this transition where the two systems are together, they are both equally noisy. So your reliability here is a bit of a problem, but luckily it doesn't make much difference. But over here, this is where noise becomes really a problem for the measurements. But if we discount that noise problem, what it turns out to be is that for this material, we're looking at about a shade 14.5 for this material, and you know, it's well within the 3% infrared criterion down in this part. So this, in fact, is a pretty nice filtered material and reliable for being used on optical equipment. Okay, we have some other stuff that's come out. Originally, we had solar eclipse glasses like this, cardboard mount with either aluminized polyester or nowadays more often what we see is this so-called black polymer material. What this is a very, very stable resin material with carbon particles embedded in it. And this is a very effective filter. Essentially, this is the same thing as smoked glass, except with a resin material where you can actually disperse it much, much more evenly, and so you get that protection without huge variations across the aperture. And of course, unlike glass, you can drop it without breaking it, which is another advantage. One of the problems that we have with the standard is it was really written for this kind of device with either the aluminized or black polymer lenses. So, we published it in September 2015. November 2015. Looks great. Actually, it does work very well, but when we start looking at the dimensions and the way this is put together, in fact, it doesn't comply with the mounting requirements that are in the ISO standard. So next week, I'm in Florida all week at an ISO conference for this particular standard review. I got to take these with me and show them and say, we need to revise the standard, which normally would have been done in 2020. It's 2017 now, so we're 2 years in. We're going to have to rewrite the standard for accounting for these types of devices. The other thing is that this type of material also is used in this kind of monolens viewer. Again, handheld up in front of both eyes like this. The only criterion that the standard has is that for this kind of mounting, it's got to cover both eyes and make sure that you can't get around it easily to get the sun into your eyes directly. So these types of viewers would comply, but they're slightly different, yeah. But they work very well. And what about these, the RS Designer Eclipse viewers? Yeah, that was the other thing I was going to say. What is that all about? Well, that's these. And in black. Right? The difference is that this is a rigid rather than flexible resin lens, which is what you would find in the paper viewers. Much more durable, a little bit more expensive, but certainly will do the job. But again, the mounting is a bit of a problem for us in terms of the European compliance, so we'll have to address that. But this actually works very, very well, and I've tried this one out quite a bit. So that's one of the designer type shades. There's also the American Paper Optics group who actually bought Roger Tuthill's solar screen business when he died, and they have since discarded solar screen, which was aluminized polyester, in favor of black polymer, and this was their sample recently. And again, you can see the problem with the noise in here. But it's very, very similar to what we see in the Rainbow Symphony sheet filters. Yeah. So they're all very, very similar. And they've got their answer to the Rainbow Symphony. That's their Eclipser HD. There we go. Cool. not designed to wear in front of your spectacles, but if you don't need glasses, they work very well. Okay. Of course, the problem is that all of these, if you have no nose bridge like I do, they still have a problem. So that's another one of these filters that's out there, and these were prepared for the AAS for their information that they're sending out. Here's the confirmation or certification marking, and this is the language that you need to look for on the devices that are being sold as of now. So conforms to and meets the transmission requirements of ISO 12312-2, filters for direct observation of the sun, and then there's some additional language that they've put in there just as sort of a weasel factor for them who haven't caught up with the ISO standard, and it either quotes the EN 1836 or the Australian standards. But again, this formal language is required on all of these things now in order to be marketed in the European Union. And the AAS has been very careful in their publicity materials for this Eclipse to say for the American public, watch for these things as part of the labeling of the device if you're looking for it. Because we also know that there's a lot of other viewers that are being brought into the States where they don't have importation controls necessarily, that are not certified or are using old certifications that aren't valid. So there's a lot of things that we have to worry about in terms of consumer awareness and consumer protection. But essentially, when it comes to looking for these devices, you look for that certification mark. Look for materials, at least in North America, that are made by either Rainbow Symphony or American Paper Optics, and you probably won't go wrong. And the other thing is be very careful when you're using these devices with children. You need to supervise children, make sure that they know how to use these things properly, and then watch them very, very carefully. You do not want to take shortcuts on this. I do recall about 10 years ago, I actually did a lawsuit that was between a school district and a group of parents where the teacher decided to obtain her own solar filters for a partial solar eclipse. And she looked in the scientific equipment catalog and she saw cobalt lenses for safety eyewear for chemistry labs, cobalt glass. And she ordered those and put them on these 12-year-olds to go out into the yard to watch the solar eclipse. I think it was actually for the Curacao solar eclipse in '98. And yeah, that was the one. It took a few years for it to get to court, but essentially she ended up with about a dozen of her grade 8 students who all had eclipse eye damage as a result of using those filters, and the school district had a pretty big legal bill after that. But it was messy. So those of you who are teachers, particularly, this is something you've got to really be very careful about. The only other thing that I would say about this is that, again, the RASC is selling these things for Eclipse Day, and when you are talking to people about these, again, make sure they know that they need to use these properly. And the thing is that you do not look at the sun and then put these things up. Okay? Put them on and then look at the sun. The other thing is, and again, if you haven't used these before, you can try them out after and just try looking through them. If you're not looking at the sun, if you look anywhere else in the environment, with these things on, you will not see anything. So you do not walk around with these things on your face. And again, that's something very important. If you're walking along, you don't want these on here. You don't know what's in front of you. Okay. All right. So again, you can feel free to take a look at some of these things later on. And one of our members here also showed, very kindly brought in his homemade solar filter with some aluminized polyester filter. And again, easy enough to do. He's used nailing tubes and cardboard, and he's made sure that this filter is really firmly fixed in here. And again, this is very important. That material can't be allowed to wiggle its way out. So you need to secure it very well. Not just a press fit here, but this is well glued in. So that it is not going to move. And that's really important. The other thing is that he's got a good length of material here to stick onto the end of the tube so it won't dislodge easily, even in a stiff breeze. And that too is important. Mike didn't mention it, but one of the things that I do notice during the partial phase is that the wind sometimes does pick up a little bit. Temperature goes down, but the wind starts to move because, of course, the eclipse path, as the umbra comes across the ground, it's relatively cooler in that area than outside. So you're going to get pressure differentials and temperature differentials that will create winds. And it does get just a little bit windy around totality as well. So that can be a bit of a critical thing. And certainly you don't want things to blow off unexpectedly. Okay, so I think that's pretty much everything I need to say about this. Almost on time, other than for the announcements.
Fantastic, Todd, thank you for that. I'm curious about the treatment of exposure. Is there any role for, say, post-exposure prophylaxis or anti-inflammatories to mitigate that latent damage?
It has been tried, and it generally doesn't work. So there essentially is no treatment other than waiting it out, unfortunately. But, people have tried steroids and so on, it doesn't seem to make much difference. The problem is, the retina is basically like brain tissue. It's very, very well isolated from the blood supply. So if you want to try and get a steroid into that damaged area, you almost have to inject it directly, and that's going to cause more damage. So it's not easy to do. And the other problem is that because it's in the very center of your vision, there really isn't an easy way of getting even an injection, the needle actually going into the retina would cause more physical damage. So it's not something you want to actually master. Other questions?
Are telescope filter manufacturers required to follow the same ISO standard?
No.
Ooh.
Because telescope and photographic filters are not personal protective devices, but these are.
Okay.
So they fall under a different classification. And that makes for a really interesting point, because there are some manufacturers of these filter materials who have basically said that for the purposes of making eclipse viewers and so on, they do not want their materials being used because they don't want the liability.
I'm just curious to know, say for one of the big European eclipses like 99, what sort of number of people actually suffer eye damage from not looking properly at an eclipse?
It's a very good question. There was a paper published by a group of British ophthalmologists who reported on about 100 cases that they got in the United Kingdom. Of those, in fact, of those 100 cases, I think only 5 of them had any significant visual losses. And it was interesting that where these people were when they got injured, none of them was in the eclipse path in the United Kingdom. They were all in the British Midlands, Scotland, Northern Ireland, anywhere but in Cornwall where the eclipse was. Of course, there might be a practical reason for that, because on the day in question, Cornwall was very highly variable, and there were a lot of areas that were actually under precipitation, so they didn't see the eclipse there. So that might have helped.
Hello.
Let's see what that.
Let's say you did get blinded. How long would you usually have to wait it out?
It's between 6 and 12 months before we know what kind of recovery you're likely to have. So there's an acute phase of about a month where the vision is really, really bad, and then the inflammatory processes start to go down, and vision starts to come back. But the retina takes a long time to repair itself. So it's not something you want to wish on anybody, for sure. No,
Can these filters that you have here be used, let's say, on binoculars or a small telescope?
If you get the material in a large enough piece, you can use them. And in fact, things like the astrosolar film from Goddard that Mike was talking about, you can actually buy sheets of that and make your own solar filters for your binoculars and so on. Again, the major factor is to make sure you've got enough there to cover the lens and enough to mount it securely, so it doesn't fall off or blow off.
Ralph, just to be absolutely clear, you cannot put these things on and then put binoculars in front of them.
Oh, definitely not.
Absolutely, for the people watching this on YouTube.
Yeah, if you're going to use those kinds of materials for filters for binoculars and so on, they've got to go on the front end of the binocular. And, then you're just looking through them. You do not have binoculars and then, put these on and
I'm glad you asked that. It was worthwhile just to see Ralph's reaction.
So you're saying that people would actually look at the sun during the pre-annular or post-annular phase before there was a total eclipse. Why would they do that? How could they keep their eyes on the sun? I mean, wouldn't automatically you would be turning away from looking at the sun itself before it was the total eclipse, during the pre-annular or post-annular?
well, during the partial phases before and after, the thing is you're trying to see what is going on.
But wouldn't that hurt your eyes? You would automatically turn away? I mean, who could look directly at the sun?
You'd be amazed. Actually, one of these photographs that I showed here in that presentation, they were of a young man who, in fact, who was in India. He bet his friends that he'd watch the partial solar eclipse, which was back in the 1970s. He bet his friends that he would be able to watch the solar eclipse without eye protection and still be able to see. Luckily, he collected immediately afterwards, because when we got the photographs of his eyes, we could actually tell from the shape of the crescent burns in his retina when he looked and how many times he looked at the sun.
That was just painful.
There was no pain. That's the point. He could burn the back of his eye without knowing it because there was no pain sensation. And so the eye was damaged. He was blind the next morning when blind meaning that he couldn't see detail.
I don't know. I was directly into the sun. I can't look at it very long.
Yeah.
It's too bright.
Well, he collected 100 rupees, so he did well. That makes them short.
Well, an important question we haven't touched on is the filter comes off during totality. So how do we know when to take it off, when to put it back on?
Do you want Ralph's answer or Michael's answer?
Experience, both of you.
Well, I would not remove the filter until I can tell that Bailey speeds are full. So I'm looking in through the filter. As soon as I can see Bailey speeds, I know I can take it off, and I can look at the sun without protection. I'll be fine. Coming out of the eclipse is a bit harder, but again, the thing is, once you start seeing Bailey's beads, you know it's going to get very bright very quickly. And it's not a question that you're going to fry your eyes immediately. You've got a little bit of time. So the thing is, as soon as Bailey's beads become visible at the end of the eclipse, you put the filters back on, and then you can see the partial phases going on. The point is that the sun is extremely bright, so you don't want to get a lot of light into your eyes because you're already dark adapted because of the light level during totality.
And once those Bailey's beads coalesce into an actual crescent, it is hellishly bright and it's very uncomfortable, and you're not going to be able to see very much. And so the thing is, you need to avoid having that overload. Another thing too, which I wanted to actually comment what Mike was saying about doing all of your preparations and manual controls. What I've found over the years is that, especially if my camera doesn't have a self-illuminated control panel on it, I have a flashlight in my pocket so that I can actually see the controls and do my shutter settings and so on. Because it is dark enough during total phase, you cannot really see what is right there. You know, you look at the sun and then look at your camera. There's enough of a brightness difference that those camera controls are extremely difficult to see without additional light.
Ralph, can I make a comment on that? For that purpose, what you really should use is what I use all the time for my astrophotography, and that is a headband light. A black diamond, for example, you get a Mountain Equipment Co-op, because they have, in addition to white light, they have a red light. And you can tilt it and so on, put it on a headband. I got 4 of them, and they're fantastic, and they don't wreck everybody else's view as well.
Well, yeah, either way works well, but you need to do something like that. Okay, our time is getting a bit long in the tooth, so we better conclude. Let's put up the announcements, and let me just very quickly go through these.